Hi there, and welcome to Ian's Engage channel. I'm Ian. Okay, so finally, after only a short 5 months break, we're back to working on the tricky bit. In the previous video in this series, I ended by temporarily connecting the two already installed sections of the tricky bit together. In this video, I'm going to attempt to connect the sections together more permanently, while still allowing the sections to be removed. As you know by now, I like a plan, so here's a list of tasks that I hope to achieve before the end of the video. First of all, I need to remove the temporary track. The track is installed on two foam sections, which I'd like to join together. I then need to prepare new track for installation. Holes need to be marked and drilled for dropper wires in the foam. Then similarly, holes need to be marked and drilled for dropper wires in the train room. Dropper wires then need to be prepared and soldered to the track. Once that is done, the dropper wires need to be tested for electrical continuity. I can then glue the track down to the foam section. The section can then be installed in the train room. And the track can then be joined to track on its adjacent sections. That's quite a lot of work to be getting on with, so let's see how much progress I can make before I have to stop to make this video. Okay, so the first thing to do was to remove the temporary track work that joined the two permanent sections of the tricky bit together. Before I removed the track, I marked the positions where I wanted the new track to end at each side of the section. Next, I used pliers to pull back the rail joiners at the end of each piece of track. I then removed the staples I'd used to secure the track to the foam. The track could then be lifted out. I also put a few orientation marks on the cork, so I wouldn't confuse which way around the two pieces of foam were meant to be positioned. Once the track was gone, I could remove the two sections of foam that the track had been laid on and take them to the workbench. It was at this point that I decided to join the two sections of foam baseboards together. I'd initially thought that having a small lift-out section of the baseboard would be beneficial, but after thinking about it, I thought it may be more of a hindrance. To join the sections together, I poked toothpicks into the end of the smaller section of foam. I then used a metal ruler to make sure that the sections were aligned at the rear. I then brought the two sections together. I then disconnected the sections and used Gorilla Wood Glue to make the join more permanent. And used engineering blocks to keep the sections flat. I then let the glue dry overnight. Next, I used the marks I'd made on the Cork roadbed to draw lines across each end of track, to make it more obvious where each track should end. I then took the section back to the train room to perform a test fit, just to make sure everything was still in alignment. And as you can see, it was. The next job was to cut some track, ready for installation. I used the lines I'd drawn to measure 3 pieces of track and then cut them using my Xeron side cutters. The Xeron cutters usually left a nice clean cut to the rails, but there were a couple of rails with burrs, so they needed to be filed down. The next job was to figure out where I wanted to place dropper wires. As a side note, I needed to take into consideration where I wanted to have feedback sensors that could be used for block detection. There were 3 tracks, and I wanted to be able to detect a train at the start, middle and end of each track. However, thinking about it, I only needed 1 dropper wire per track, as these were the middle sections, and feedback for the start and end points were catered for in the sections I'd already installed. So that meant there were only 3 holes that needed to be drilled in the foam to accommodate dropper wires. As well as marking the location of the holes on the baseboard, I also marked the sleepers either side of the hole, as these would need to be moved before dropper wires were added. I used a carpenter's awl to make a hole in the cork where I intended to drill. I then used a 6mm drill bit to drill through the cork. I should have used my drill guide to do this, but as usual, when a tool was needed, it seemed to have gone missing. I used a straw to make sure that the holes I drilled were free from obstruction. Then the next job was to make space for the dropper wires. The sleeper webbing needed to be removed from the sleepers on either side of where the wires would be soldered. Once this was done, the sleepers could be moved aside to make enough space to easily add solder pads to the underside of the exposed rail. Once the sleepers had been moved, I used a few Type 90 staples to pin each piece of track temporarily into position to see how everything fit together. The next job was to use the holes that had been drilled into the foam baseboard as a template to mark holes that needed to be drilled in the train room. The foam section was taken to the train room and slotted back into position. Cocktail sticks were then placed through the holes in order to mark the foam below. The foam section was then removed, leaving the cocktail sticks in place. I then returned to the workbench where I used my Greyboard track setter-like templates to ensure that the tracks were straight and the correct distance apart. I fixed the track separators to the baseboard using staples, so I'd be able to push the track up against them when it came to gluing it down. The next job was to solder the dropper wires to the underside of the track, so I removed the track from the foam and prepared it. Now, I've shown how I've done this a few times on the channel, but I'll go through it again as I think it's a good method. First of all, I like to rough up the bottom of the rail with a file. I then add some liquid flux, which flows into the abrasions made with the file. I then introduce some solder to create the pad on the underside of the rail. Next, I strip some wire. Then tin the wire using liquid flux first before applying the solder from the tip of the iron. I then use pliers to create a 90-degree bend in the wire and cut off any excess. I then solder the tinned wire to the solder pad, angling the wire towards the middle of the track, where it will eventually disappear down the hole in the foam. Once the dropper wires have been soldered to the rails, they're checked for electrical connectivity. I used a multimeter in continuity mode to do this. It's always a good idea to check that the multimeter is working before you start. Then it was a simple case of listening for the beeps as I connected the end of the dropper wire to the rail it had been soldered to. Next, I remounted the 3 pieces of track and tested that the dropper wires didn't foul the roadbed. I also fitted rail joiners to the ends of each rail to ensure that I'd removed all of the end of rail burrs before gluing the track down. Now that the dropper wires had been tested and the train room prepared, I used copy decks to stick the track down to the Cork roadbed and used staples as well as engineering blocks to weigh the track down. You may have noticed that none of the tracks reach the end of the baseboard. This is obviously intentional and necessary, as otherwise I wouldn't be able to join the tracks together with the adjacent sections. Okay, so that's all I had time for in this update, and I didn't quite get to the end of my list. But let's see what was achieved and what's left to do. I removed the temporary track work from the train room that had been installed on 2 pieces of foam baseboard. I glued the 2 pieces of foam baseboard together to make a more stable platform for the track to be installed on. I then prepared the track for installation, cutting it to length and removing any burrs of metal that were present on the rails. Next, I marked and drilled holes for dropper wires into the baseboard, before making space for the dropper wires by moving the sleepers around. I then marked where the dropper wire holes would be drilled in the train room, although I refrained from drilling the holes themselves. Dropper wires were then soldered to the rails of each track. Once the dropper wires were attached, I checked them for electrical continuity. Then finally I glued the track down to the Cork roadbed. So that means that the list of things to do for this section has shrunk considerably, with these being the only things left to do. I need to drill holes for the dropper wires in the train room. I can then install the new section in the train room, and then I need to join the newly installed pieces of track to their adjacent sections of track. As usual, let me know what you think. Alternatively, if you've got any hints, tips, useful tools or techniques to pass on to a fellow N-Gage modeller, or if you simply want to say hello, then please do so in the comment section. Anything and everything you've got to say will be greatly appreciated. In the meantime, thanks ever so much for watching. Hopefully I'll have another update on my progress soon. Bye.